welcome to the Theology Pugcast, and we are back in virtual reality, which isn't really real, but my friends are real. They just happen to really be in other places. So we're kind of back, back to our points of origin now, and I'll let the guys tell you where they are in a minute. But I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm sitting here in Battleground, Washington, and enjoying kind of the temperate weather, but kind of the wet weather that you get this time of year in the Pacific Northwest. I've written a few things, and my book on Tom Bombadil is available for pre-order, and perhaps by the time this show comes out, it may even be ready to actually physically send out to folks. But anyway, enough about me. Why don't you tell us about yourselves, guys? I'll start with you, Tom.
I'm Tom Price. I teach systematic theology, philosophy, and ethics at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and a few other places. And I'm enjoying a nice down east cider. I think something Glenn used to get with a cranberry twist to start the holidays. So, cheers, everyone.
All right. Yeah, we're looking forward to celebrating Thanksgiving tomorrow. By the time you hear this show, it'll be almost Christmas. But anyway, it's almost Thanksgiving for us. Okay, Glenn.
Yeah, I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a retired history professor from Central Connecticut State University, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and I work for Reflections Ministries in Atlanta. I'm living in South Bend right now, and I'm missing my Down East cider, but I do have an Edmund Fitzgerald Porter from Great Lakes Brewing.
Yeah, well, okay. The Edmund Fitzgerald, that's of course a boat that went down in a storm, and I think that they've been kind of doing a little more work and trying to figure out just what happened. It's been a mystery.
Yeah, actually, they do know.
Okay.
What happened is the ship got caught between two waves. One lifted the bow, one lifted the stern, and it just broke in the middle.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, man. It's a moving song. If you ever want to check it out, Gordon Lightfoot, sang a tribute to the men of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And anyway, enough of that. So we finished up our Pacific Northwest tour, and we are really pleased with how it went. It was tremendous success. It's hard to say how many people were actually physically at the various events we had. Maybe as many as 1,000 people, but we had people from all over the place who came out to see us, and we were very gratified by that. Really quite humbled as well, and thank you for your support. We've been thinking about another tour, Gluttons for Punishment. That's what we are, and what we've thought about is maybe we should do something in the Southeast. We've got a lot of folks who listen to the show in that part of the country. Actually, we got people who listen to the show all over the world. I've done a little deep dive on the data, and I was sharing that the other day, and it's just remarkable that we have as many people listening to us as we do from places outside the United States. We've got large audience in Brazil. We even have an audience in France and in Norway, and it just struck me as just astonishing. But anyway, so much for that. We're grateful for your presence with us wherever you are. And today, it's my day. As long-term listeners to the podcast know, we kind of take a turn introducing the subject of the day. And I want to talk about the death of the church growth movement. So this is kind of a requiem. But I think the church growth movement requires a little bit of, explanation for people to sort of understand what I'm going to be, saying with regard to the Requiem. So giving folks a little bit of background, in the United States in particular, but throughout the world over the since the 1970s, there has been a phenomenon known as the church growth movement that really has swept through the evangelical world and has even infiltrated other parts of the Christian world. And its origins can be traced back to the work of Donald McGavran. Donald McGavran was a missionary, and from everything I've heard, a really good guy. He actually founded an institute for the study of church growth in Oregon. I think it was in Bend. And eventually, he was brought onto the faculty at Fuller Theological Seminary, part of their missiology program there. And in those days, in the 70s and 80s, Fuller was the place to be. It exercised tremendous influence in the evangelical world. I don't think it exercises nearly the influence today that it once did, but regardless, in those days, it was huge. And McGavran was sort of the pioneer when it comes to the church growth movement, but there were popularizers who came along after him. C. Peter Wagner, for example, who was also a faculty member at Fuller and a missionary. And then people like John Wimber, who was part of the Vineyard movement and kind of got the signs and wonders sort of thing going in the early 80s. And then there were a range of people from various denominations that went to Fuller to study. And I think this is one of the things that is lost on folks. Fuller became a place where, sort of church growth and evangelism executives from denominations as, diverse as the Southern Baptist Convention, the Church of the Nazarene. I, in fact, was good friends with the guy that was the head of the church growth department of the Church of the Nazarene, a guy named Bill Sullivan. And he was a really good guy and was very supportive of the sorts of things I was into and working on. But, everybody from, the Pentecostals and the Assemblies of God to the Baptists to the Presbyterians, I think that it's pretty evident that Tim Keller has been strongly influenced by the church growth movement and was kind of one of the leading figures there alongside Harvey Kahn. So, so throughout evangelicalism, the church growth movement has been influential.
Now, Chris,
sure.
Before you get into the details of the church growth movement, it might be worth reviewing some of the key ideas that McGavran had as a missiologist.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great thing to do. What I wanted in getting into that, I'd like to take a look at a few things that I think characterize the church growth movement, and then we could talk about some of the specific things that McGavran was known for. Imagine you're thinking along the lines of people movements and homogeneous unit principle and things like that.
Yeah.
But I think with regard to the church growth movement, I think that the thing that McGavran was up to and what appealed to so many people with regard to the movement was his heavy reliance on social science. So he, was interested in, sort of bringing into the service of the church the disciplines of anthropology, sociology, even psychology, to understand why churches grow. Now, this seems innocuous. It seems like, how could you ever sort of criticize anybody for wanting to sort of employ those disciplines in the study of the growth of Christianity. Well, the problem is not so much, what may sort of appear on the surface to be justifiable. What I think it caused problems was the reality that many of the assumptions that went into the social sciences or sort of are at work in the social sciences were left unexamined and were not sort of appraised theologically as well as they could have been. There were certain flashpoints, for example, the homogeneous unit principle. Let me just briefly note that. And there were lots of critics with regard to that from the start. But the homogeneous unit principle is essentially a kind of a common sense observation that, generally speaking, people tend to sort of live in social environments, and those social environments are comfortable for the people who live in them. And consequently, if you expect someone to make a significant sort of change in their lives, particularly with regard to, their religious affiliations, then it's helpful if you don't require a lot of other sort of dramatic sort of adjustments. If you can kind of narrow it in and say, okay, people tend to make decisions that don't require, sort of extraneous or sort of collateral changes in their lives, that's helpful. So if I'm, say, a person in India and I belong to a particular caste, then asking me to attend a church that is made up of people from other castes requires me not only to do so to worship Christ, it also requires me to spend some time with people that I'm not comfortable with because they belong to another caste. Now, the criticism that was sort of directed at the church growth movement for this sort of common sense observation is that it seems kind of racist or classist to just kind of allow a society to sort of be unchallenged with regard to the content of the Christian faith as it relates to those kinds of social structures that can be in place.
Yeah, no, this is where, again, we need to sort of back up and look at where McGavran was coming from here. What he noted in studying specifically India was that there were some places where the gospel spread very quickly, and there were others where there was virtually no fruit at all. And what he, as he studied this, what he found was the critical thing for the spread of Christianity was whether or not, how close the person who was bringing the gospel was to the group in terms of, if he was part of the group, it was more likely that churches would be founded and things would move forward. If he was in a closely related culture, the same thing would happen. But the further away he was culturally from the group, the less effective the evangelism was. So it begins with a study of what was actually already happening. And his conclusion was that cultural proximity was extremely important for effective evangelism. Okay, that's where it begins. Now, the problem, I think, comes when people start trying to apply that in other kinds of contexts. But it begins with that. And it wasn't just a theoretical model for him. It was based on his observations of what was already happening on the ground.
Yeah. And I think that, there are things about his work that we can say, well, that's an accurate description of what's going on. And I think that there are some things that we can derive from that kind of research that are helpful. So, for example, not only when it comes to the sort of the barriers to the Christian faith and openness of populations to the message, does it make sense for people to hear the message from somebody that they can identify with and can identify with them. There are other dynamics within which, sort of the growth of the Christian faith is affected by the social conditions. Just like in any sort of local church, for example, it's pretty clear that churches grow quite sort of naturally to a certain point. And then at that point, they kind of plateau. And people have wondered what, is behind this. Are people not praying enough? Are they not sharing their faith enough? And so forth. And it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of difference whether or not you do those things. What seems to be at work is just sort of a group dynamic. So, for example, I've talked about this in various settings. I've said, if I'm a person who goes to church and my primary objective at sort of the fellowship time at the church is to sort of strengthen the relationships I already have and enjoy those relationships, that more or less sort of in effect unintentionally leaves out people that I could connect with who don't have any connections in the church yet. So that's one reason why sometimes visitors at a worship service will feel like they've been unloved or sort of connected to. No one has sort of reached out to them, and it's not necessarily because people have gone to church thinking, I'm not going to connect with new people today. I'm just going to spend all my time with people I know. It's simply the limitations of our human nature that sort of restrict the number of people we can know and have relationships with. So how many people can you actually know and be friends with? Well, if everyone in a particular group of people, are interested in maintaining the relationships that they have, then there's no way to get in. And it just so happens that when a church gets to about 120 to 180 people in size, this happens every time because they're just the dynamics of the social environment that limit the church's ability to grow beyond that number or that size. There have been two strategies for dealing with this. One is that when you get to this size, it's time to plant another church, or you restructure the way you go about having church. Maybe you set up a church with several smaller groups, and then all these groups participate in a larger sort of institution. So I think that these kinds of observations that I think have come to us through the church growth movement are worth noting, and I think that they're helpful. But I do think that there's something else going on with the church growth movement that we're blind to. Tom, I can see you're chomping at the bit.
Yeah, well, no, I'm just thinking through some of the stuff. Maybe this is going to go where you're doing is I think, on the descriptive level, if you're looking at certain kinds of realities and conditions that are in place that tend to have a certain kind of outcome, that's fine. It can help us understand certain limits that we have, in a kind of natural way. And then we can also recognize that there may be barriers going on that we can kind of at least in principle accept. But I think a lot of the people who studied McGavran, I think this is probably where you'll go. I know we did in seminary and on our missiology class. They start to move it from descriptive to normative, and they start to almost see these as principles that you have to abide by, or this description of reality is such that it is almost the case always, to where they start to import it as almost a fate that the gospel has to kind of place as a container around it.
Right. More or less you have to accommodate the gospel to this rather than sort of understand these realities within the framework of the gospel. So what is sort of defining what? I think that there are, the resources within the Christian faith to understand these things and to work with them and even to, put them in their proper place or places. But when these things become what ends up happening, here's my take on the church growth movement in general. It's instrumentalist and pragmatic in sort of its approach, which means that it's already sort of importing into the work of missions and evangelism a kind of secular sort of contemporary spirit that we see at work, in sort of just, sort of like the West in general today. We've talked about the limitations of pragmatism and utilitarianism in the past and how they tend to have a kind of effect on the way our society works today that loses touch with the kind of metaphysical sort of realities that really are at work in our world, but these things are blind to.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening is that because there's this sort of instrumental, sort of pragmatic approach to propagating the faith, we do it in a way that kind of formats the faith in a way that is in accord with pragmatism and utilitarianism and instrumentalism and so forth. And there are a range of consequences for that. We've talked about one of the consequences repeatedly, and that's our failure to see the world as a meaningful place. We don't think of of creation the way Christians should think of creation. We think of creation in the way that pragmatists and utilitarians think of creation, which is a kind of denuded and sort of a mechanistic thing. And so, because that's the case, our churches resemble, they just become shopping malls or entertainment centers, or they no longer are designed to reflect the marvelous and meaningful creation that surrounds us. Instead, they're kind of pared down to be like, well, anybody that's attended, a church that was influenced by the church growth movement knows what I'm talking about.
I think a good point you made a little bit earlier about the importing without examining the assumptions. One good place where we can see that is exactly what you just talked about, the way in which many churches in the U.S. using a lot of this principle of familiarity and comfortable have made the church basically a place, a field of entertainment choices or agreeable things. And what that has imported is a view of the human being as basically an unpremised will that is determining and picking things that accord with its wants and desires. So there is no conversion of the will required. There is no form to shape the direction of that will other than these different options. And so as soon as that entertaining value or choice runs out, you either have to keep making, you have to turn it into a theme park basically, or a shopping mall, or eventually it's just going to go out of business. And I think that's one of the, characteristic places you can really see, at least in the U.S. versions of it, the limits of that principle. It's empirical and on the surface, and it's kind of church made in the image of the desires and wants of the society or the culture or the individual, and so
actually, Tom, it's worse than that.
Mm-hmm. Tell us the good news, Glenn.
Deeper, dark secret.
Because we live in a society that has a multiplicity of subcultures. So what ends up happening is the pastor or the church board or whoever makes these decisions picks the subculture that they want to appeal to.
Yeah.
I am not a Rick Warren basher. Okay, I know a lot of people who really hold Rick in pretty low regard. I've met him. I've worked with him a little bit. I think he's generally a pretty good guy. Okay, so let's just be clear about that. Purpose-driven life, if anything in that was a surprise to you and you've been a Christian for more than 2 months, you need to join a new church. Okay, I mean, it's basic stuff. And Rick's got a lot of personal integrity. For example, he keeps a notebook of all of the scandals that have befallen Christian leaders. He keeps a notebook full of the clippings of these, and he reads it every month. Okay, so this is a guy who's really concerned with integrity. But in one of his, I believe it was one of his earlier books, Purpose-Driven Church, one of the things he says is that you need to decide what demographic you are going for, and you have to select your music accordingly. You have to pick your music to appeal to that demographic. I was at Saddleback at one point when I was working with them, and I looked at their board, and they had something like 13 different styles of worship, depending on what kind of music you wanted. And then they would pipe in the sermon depending on which room you were in, depending on the style of worship you wanted. I understand what he's doing, and I kind of, I get it. But the fact of the matter is, one of the hallmarks of the gospel is it's supposed to bridge the gaps between people. And the critical flaw in the whole church growth methodology, and what I would argue is where Rick goes wrong here. And like I said, I like Rick. I don't have anything against him. I think he's a great guy, and I think he's doing good work. But what he is missing is that what the gospel is supposed to do is to unite people who are otherwise separate. The dividing wall of hostility, not just between Jew and Gentile, but between all peoples, is supposed to be eliminated in Christ. And so when you're targeting a specific demographic or a specific subculture or something like that, you are in effect denying the nature of the body of Christ.
Yeah, and I think related to that, we get into one of the excesses of the church growth movement, or perhaps maybe one of the ways that it sort of prepared the groundwork for, is sort of the marketing of Christianity using, contemporary marketing techniques. So you end up with an approach to promoting the Christian faith that is hard to distinguish from salesmanship. Mm-hmm. So when I look at the work of the apostles in Scripture, of course they're trying to communicate, and of course they're using methods to connect with people. We think about Paul, and his statements about being, all things to all men, so that by all means we may save some. And you see him at Mars Hill, we see him in the synagogue. He's using these different sort of approaches to reach people, but within that framework, he's not talking about what I think many of these people are sort of presuming. I think presume that he's talking about. I think that what many of the contemporary people who have adopted church growth methodology have done is they've more or less said that culture is kind of a meaningless sort of framework within which we are working to create conditions to encourage people to have a personal relationship with Jesus. So what ends up happening is Christianity is kind of boiled down to this sort of inner state. I've got my portable Jesus who goes with me wherever I go. And, the pastor helps me understand how my portable Jesus can help me sort of deal with the problems in my life at home, or how, my portable Jesus can help me at work. There may even be an affirmation of Christ's lordship, but there's no sense that people, I think, are encouraged to sort of think about with regard to culture as such. If you get what I'm getting at, it's more or less this is a kind of area that we don't call into question. Now, I've got some theories as to why that has kind of played out the way it has. But do you have any thoughts on what I've just said, and maybe some things maybe I've missed that you think that we ought to kind of throw in here?
Yeah, Tom, why don't you go ahead?
Okay.
Okay, it looked like you're about to say something.
Yeah, it was. I tend to. I always have a thought right on the tip of my tongue, and then when I'm supposed to say it, I lose it. But anyway, I do have it. But one of the things I was thinking about is that notion you were just talking about, that when we have such a thinned out view of creation and meaning, and we are working in a culture that has everything of significance within this immanent frame, to use a Charles Taylor term, that within the here and now, the secular, then the church becomes a place of meaning construction in many ways, rather than attuning to the form that we've been given and utilizing that as the shape of how we interact with things. And what do I mean by that? I think you hit something key, is the church has become almost seen as having very little significance, other than being a place at which you can somehow communicate this therapeutic relationship with the psychological therapist in the sky kind of thing. I mean, I don't want to be mean, but that tends to be a lot of the driving force, rather than it being the part of the restored created order, truthfully enacting itself in its form of life, which has been given to us in Christ and spelled out in the scriptures, as it is oriented towards its transcendent source and fulfillment. And so the church, for example, oftentimes think of it this way: we have, maybe in some high formal churches, we have a lot of immutable forms, the liturgy that stays the same, but then we have the content of the gospel is basically mutable. It's constantly trying to appease to the intelligence of the age. And then in the flip side, you have a immutable theology, right? But somehow the form in which it comes can be shifted and shaped. It doesn't matter. Whereas what you have, which is, I think, the ground of our theology, is Jesus Christ, in which the form that he takes as human is the fitting one to match who he is as the second person of the Godhead. So the church, as carrying out a form of life which is formed by Christ, has an order and a meaning and a direction that doesn't need to be filled in by these other things. It needs to actually be, the meaning has to be described and explicated and lived. And I think because that stuff has been, even redemption, therefore, has become so minimized and replaced by something else, I think that this is why you have, the church as basically an empty shell that we need to fill in order to make people feel like this is going to be significant for them.
You brought out something I think that is really worth just sort of reinforcing, and that is that with regard to the main line, we can see that the forms with regard to the liturgy appear to be consistent with what's been handed down.
Yeah.
But we know that when we get the priest or the lesbian priestess or whatever, over in the corner, and we ask him or her, "What do you mean by that?"
You ask them. Them.
Yeah, them. That's
Sorry,
right. That's right.
I'm still confused.
But what they tell you is just sort of like the pablum of the sort of the moment, sort of the ethos of the moment, and they've just sort of poured into the forms something that's utterly alien.
Yeah.
Whereas when you go to these sort of seeker-sensitive, evangelical, supposedly conservative churches, you have the reverse. What neither of them seem to be able to do is hold the two things together.
Yeah. It's worth noting, the irony here is that if you preserve, like in the Episcopal Church, if you preserve the Book of Common Prayer, you hear the gospel. It's in the liturgy. They just don't believe it.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that what you have are two different forms of liberalism, and this is where I think I can offend my evangelical friends.
I think it's right.
What I tell them is that your particular form of liberalism, and you don't recognize it as such, is a kind of market liberalism. Their liberalism is a more kind of political liberalism, or maybe kind of metaphysical liberalism. And in effect, you're just kind of like telling the opposite sides of the same modern story. You're not actually telling, you're not proclaiming the gospel. You're not proclaiming the truth about reality with a capital R. You're just simply, you've just simply found different ways of accommodating the spirit of the age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The thing that I think it's important to note here is the connection between point out more directly the connection between these ideas in the church growth movement and McGavran. Because what has happened is that, again, this emphasis, find the demographic you're going for. Well, it turns out that all the successful megachurch pastors have decided that the demographic that they're going for is upper middle class whites. And this is the unreached people that we are going to try to reach. And so we're going to design everything we do to appeal to that group because cultural proximity matters. So we've got to make this a place where they're going to be comfortable, where they'll come in, where they'll feel welcomed, and all of that kind of thing. That's the other problem.
Well, I think that that's huge. I think that because if we look at the growth of the church as a marketing challenge, kind of in which we are sort of segmenting the population in the same way that demographers do in order to help, XYZ company, find its potential customer base. Well, then you end up not so much proclaiming the gospel about reality, so much as you are sort of like focused in on the particular, I guess, felt needs. There's a term that you find a lot in this literature, the felt needs of this particular group. Sometimes you can kind of dress it up. Occasionally I've criticized Tim Keller. I think Tim Keller is a marketing genius, and he figured out how to reach a particular market in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And he's more or less been able to sort of kind of focus in on that, and at the same time hold out the theme of justice as sort of cultural sort of influence as a kind of bromide that allows people to kind of enjoy this very sort of like insular and homogeneous environment. So I've been to the church maybe 4 or 5 times. And one of the things you don't see in Tim Keller's church is children. In fact, I've had people tell me who've attended his church. Now, of course, he's retired now, and I know that he's dealing with cancer. And I don't think that I look at him much in the same way that you look at Rick Warren, Glenn. I don't think that he's like a sinister person or anything. And even though some people have accused him of kind of cultural Marxism, I think that it's not so much the result of a kind of consistent sort of principled working out of his theological sort of outlook, as much as it is marketing. See, what I think Tim Keller is a great marketer. and I think that that justice, and I know this sounds terribly cynical, and I'm not trying to imply that it is as mercenary as maybe it sounds that I'm making it, but there is something to it. I think that the kind of the interest in justice is something that characterizes upper middle class white people in Manhattan on the Upper East Side, and so it fits. It fits with this target demographic. Yeah. One of the things you don't see at Tim Keller's church, at least as far as I know, is any attempt to explain or to apologize for, to help people understand the Trump voter. That just doesn't happen there. It's not as though at least if it's happened, I apologize and I take it back. But I have no evidence for any interest in understanding the Trump voter among the people that at least I've been able to encounter in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And I think I understand the Upper East Side of Manhattan pretty well. But anyway, before you guys jump in, and I want to give you some time to jump in, I want to say I do want to get to why I think that the church growth movement is dead, and want to spend some time on that. But anyway, go ahead and throw in anything you want to throw in at this point.
Glenn, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think that again, I'm going to go back to McGavran. I think McGavran had a lot of really good insights. I think that the problem is the way those insights have been applied in the American context. This segmenting the church. I mean, even within a church, segmenting it up into different groups so that we've got our children's ministry, we've got our youth ministry, we've got our singles ministry, we've got our young marrieds ministry, we got our, everybody else ministry. Excuse me, I forgot women's ministry and men's ministry. We segment the church up with the idea that, there is a certain degree of validity there that these different groups need different things. And so, I mean, I can understand an element of that. But if you never have an integrating point, you never have anything that brings all of them together. And I'm thinking particularly children here, where so many churches have their children's church program, and the children never really participate in the main service. What you're doing is you're teaching the children that church is for my parents, and no matter how old you get, you're never your parents. You're actually raising children to be unchurched. You know, this idea of segmenting everything up really denies in many ways the unity of the body. It's not to say that there's no place for that, but the lack of integration, it seems to me, is a real problem structurally with the way the church growth movement operates. Because one of the things we've got to do is demonstrate how the gospel is good news for everybody, regardless of your group, and to demonstrate the unity of the body of Christ.
In a weird way, this is one reason why traditionalist Catholics have a point when they call for the Latin Mass. Mm-hmm. It's as alien to every group as can be. In other words, the Latin Mass is not something that appeals to English speakers, but not to French speakers. It's as alien to English speakers as it is to French speakers. It's alien to everybody.
Although let me tell you a quick story there. Bob Kingdon, my doctoral advisor, was in Poland at one point, and they were doing a tour of a monastery. And the basically sort of like a janitor was kind of taking them around and showing them places and all that. And he seemed really, really bored. And they had a translator there. And somebody wanted to ask a question. And so the translator was going to do this. And the guy put up his hand and said, "Hold it." And he asked the question in Latin.
Right.
And the caretaker got really excited at that point, and he answered in Latin. And the rest of the tour, the guy was just really pumped because he had people who understood him.
Well, but that's the other side of it, is that here we have this language that no one can sort of lay claim to. Now we can say that Latin languages, like French and Italian and so forth, have some advantages, but nevertheless, it's a language that Chinese. Yeah, that's right. This is Poland, but this is a language that Chinese speakers and people from the Philippines who are Catholics. So it becomes kind of here's a weird way of putting it, the lingua franca of the church.
Common language. Another example, I worked with a guy who was a Catholic back in a previous lifetime when I was a tech writer for a computer company. And Bill told me that he thought one of the biggest problems with Vatican II was switching away from the Latin Mass.
Yeah.
And I told him, I thought that was kind of crazy. And he said, "But wait a minute. When I was in the Navy, I went to Japan and I went for communion. And the priest looked at me and said, 'Hoc est corpus meum.' I understood that and I could say amen. If he had said it in Japanese, for all I knew, he could have been saying your fly is open."
Right. Yeah. I don't want to make this an argument for the Latin Mass, but I think
what theologically is important there is something that early on in the church they had to wrestle with when you started to have, from a variety of theological schools, a differing point of emphasis on how they were going to explain certain doctrines. The church understood very quickly there had to be a kind of uniformity that was best to be held by all people ascribing to orthodoxy. And that would be, they would do it as a shared faith, saying the creed in common. But I think this is where you saw early on an attempt to lay out a kind of Christian liturgy, at least, and it wasn't shared everywhere all the same. But there was a large continuity. So even as the church went into different cultures, and those cultures obviously were going to spill over into the practice of the church. You'll have different styles of music and things like that. But they all were still sharing in this kind of unified way of doing this. And this is very much, that one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all. I mean, if we're not pushing that theological point, then all of that kind of familiarity of context ends up becoming almost an identity point for a group of Christians here, and then there's a group over there, but there is really no unified faith that they all share. And I think that's something that again, I think some of the problems of taking those principles in the wrong direction can lead.
Yeah, and I think this is where the sacraments serve us in a really important way, and why I serve a church that celebrates the Lord's Supper every week.
Yeah, I think so.
It's everything kind of builds to that, and I think that's great.
Yeah.
I think that when you lack that the unifying power of the sacraments, then you lose something that ties you into the universal church around the world and throughout time. Well, I want to spend a little time now on why I think the church growth movement is dead. And I think that even though there are certain insights that are sound and will stay with us, I think as a kind of sort of bromide for dealing with evangelism, there are two ways that we can say that it's dead. First, it didn't work. In other words, this was something that was presented to us as the means by which we would be able to evangelize not only unreached people in other parts of the world, but the West. So there was a lot of enthusiasm, particularly in the late 70s and 80s and 90s, for the practice of church growth as we've criticized it. But it hasn't led to what people said it would lead to, which was the evangelization of Western culture and a kind of recovery of maybe a broadly celebrated understanding of Christ as King. So that in some places that was explicitly stated, in other places it was just implied. So it didn't work. But the other thing I think that is important to keep in mind is stuff that's happening at the moment that make church growth, as it's been laid out by the church growth movement, almost impossible to practice. One of those things is COVID-19. So COVID. So what's sort of been the operational mode for church growth churches? Well, it's been sort of the large gathering, right? Think about that. Mm-hmm. So it's been the large gathering where you create this experience that will appeal to a particular subculture, right? Whether it's cowboy church or, like you see out in, the Chicagoland area with, Bill Hybels and Willow Creek, sort of like late night television entertainment. You think about it. What was Bill Hybels up to? He was up to creating kind of a late night television experience, kind of like Johnny Carson or whatever. On Sunday morning. That was his shtick. And but wherever you go, this whole sort of we're going to create this just unbelievable sort of experience for people. It's just gone. So everybody's worshiping via some kind of virtual experience. So they're at home watching on their computers. Well, you can watch a lot of things on your computer. You could spend time looking at YouTube videos. You could spend time watching your pastor, preach. You could, so anyway, so that is gone. But the other thing I think that's been the death knell is throughout the last 30 years, 40 years, basically church leadership has done this: licked its finger and put it up to the wind. Which way is the wind blowing? The idea being that sort of the culture is going in a particular direction, And what you do is you hop on your surfboard, or you get your sail unfurled, and you just allow that sort of cultural trend to propel you. Now, what's been going on in our society? Well, with the sexual revolution kind of going to its logical, sort of being carried out to its logical conclusion, you've got basically church growth pastors trying to figure out some way to accommodate the work of the church to the trends with regard to sexuality. And that's why we have things like, Revoice, et cetera. But then there's the racial dynamic, with Black Lives Matter and all that kind of stuff, and critical theory. And those two things, critical theory and the sexual revolution, are very sort of self-consciously and explicitly anti-Christian. So there's no way for you to kind of like package the Christian faith in a way that is still Christian and harmonize with those trends. So anyway, I think that getting back to the observation that you made earlier, Glenn, about church growth as being something that developed in the context of missions and has been applied to the American or even the Western culture. The thing that's different between India and Western culture is that Western culture is in a phase of its development that's explicitly anti-Christian, self-consciously anti-Christian. And we simply cannot ask what's relevant and allow the world to tell us what's relevant. We find ourselves in a position today where we have to challenge the culture at every point if we're going to remain Christian. We simply cannot give the culture or concede to the culture the right to determine for us the terms of our proclamation. So I believe the church growth movement is dead for those reasons.
Yeah, it's worth noting that, I think I've said this on the podcast before, but I've said it in a lot of other places too, that I think in a lot of ways evangelicalism, once it moved out of fundamentalism and sort of became mainstream in the late 70s, 1976, Time magazine declared the year of the evangelical. Once that happened, we actually became kind of addicted to popularity and to cultural relevance. And, prior to that, you look at the fundamentalists, they didn't give a rip about cultural relevance. They were going to do their thing and, let the culture sink. But once evangelicals became sort of mainstreamed, I think that they got addicted to popularity. And so now a lot of the whole megachurch movement is really all about, I think, in a lot of ways, maintaining, quote, relevance. And there's nothing less relevant than a church that tries to be relevant. Yeah. And influence and popularity with the people that they think matter. And the net result is that we've moved in the direction of one compromise after another, so that our so-called worship services now consist of a concert followed by a TED Talk.
Right.
Well, and
we've completely accommodated ourselves to the forms of the culture without critically sort of evaluating those forms.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, and this again is very symptomatic of a loss of the Christian transcendental vision. When I talk about the Christian vision of transcendence, I'm not talking about something that is irrelevant to now. I'm talking about the most fundamental significance of what matters now and on earth, and about the future of creation. But because of that, it's, they're kind of easy tags. It's a confusion of the spirit of the age with this, the spirit of the ages. And I think that's a fair criticism. I think there is this strong desire to tap into that kind of force that populism and trends and fashion have, that somehow is the only thing that can actualize the significance of of the gospel and Christianity. I mean, I know Schleiermacher fell for this kind of stuff and set conditions up. Charles Finney and the kind of revivals of measuring results. But I think you really have there that Christianity needs to be actualized, and the actualization of it is not the power of God, the gospel, and then trying to take the ramifications of the gospel for all things into our examination of these forces and these trends and these movements. Rather, instead, we just jump into them thinking somehow we're going to either convert them or influence them, or at least be carried along with them so that we don't go out of things. It's a loss of, it's really a loss of our connectedness to formal and final causes. It's a loss of our connectedness to our transcendent origin, sustenance, and true ends. Because we need something in this world that's bigger than us, a set of forces like popularity or large amounts of people to become that which makes what we do significant. It's an idolatry. Right. It's a sick form of idolatry, in my opinion. I think that's,
Yeah, I think you're right, Tom. I guess the thought that comes to my mind at this moment is then, okay, what's next? So I'm of the conviction that the church growth movement swept through evangelical institutions, our colleges, our publications, and we find ourselves in a spot now where theology has been instrumentalized.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is theology is no longer the thing that dictates or tells us what reality is. Theology is something that we, I guess, work with or sort of adapt to conditions that we think will help us to grow our institutions. And because that's the case, there's nothing, in the minds of many people, there's nothing less relevant than theology. Isn't that weird?
Yeah.
So historically, theology was the discipline that told the world what. Told the world the meaning of things, right?
Yeah.
This is why you should do this. This is why you should do that. Yeah. Now it's sort of like, okay, show us theology, why you even matter.
Yeah.
And but anyway, so that's the situation we find ourselves in. And something like Christianity Today, the magazine, back in the 60s, in the early days of its life, it was endeavoring to establish the terms within which we would understand the world. Now, it's just desperately trying to remain relevant, trying to help the church remain relevant, justify its existence.
Yeah.
Christianity is the religion that tells the world how it can justify its existence.
Well, that's exactly how we have it backwards. That's exactly what I think. When I would talk about what we often call conservative evangelical theology, was already working within the conditions of the Enlightenment and liberalism. Because it thought, even its approach to reason, is somehow we have to justify ourselves in our place in things by making sure we measure up to the standards. God, basically God in the dock, right? No, it's not God in the dock. We're in the dock. Society's in the dock.
That's right. Yeah, that society's in the dock. The world's in the dock. We're right in the dock. And we have revealed to us the judge. The judge is Christ. He's our Redeemer, but he's also our judge.
And
I can tell you. Go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to say, and the measure has been revealed. Both in creation and in the fullest sense in revelation in Christ. That so we have the measure of all these things, and yet we've lost confidence in it. I think we've lost sight of it. That's a lot of it. But let me pass to Glenn. I know he's working on some ideas.
No, I think that the church growth movement, I would analyze it pretty similarly in terms of its failure, but ultimately it's a failure because it fails to actually take into account what the gospel really is and what it says. And instead, it's become addicted to this idea of relevance, to metrics that are drawn from essentially business models of the church,
Right.
things like that. So I'm in complete agreement with you. I think that if what's going on elsewhere in the world is any indication, the thing that's going to end up replacing it and replacing it successfully is going to be church planting. It's going to be networks of small churches. I think that that's actually the ideal situation in a country that is becoming increasingly hostile to the gospel. And
Yeah.
I think that that's ultimately going to be the future of Christianity.
Yeah, I think we have to take the long view, and I think that we have to work toward a world that perhaps won't be realized for 100, 200 years from now. So what are the things that we can do now? I mean, a person like Rod Dreher talks about the Benedict Option.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Benedict Option is essentially a means to weather a storm. There's something that's going on that things that can be shaken are being shaken, things that will not be shaken will remain. So the Benedict Option is an attempt to talk about how we can invest ourselves in the things that can't be shaken, things that will remain. And I think that's kind of the outlook we need to have. In the meantime, I do think that most evangelical denominations, if not all of them, have in some sense been seduced by the church growth movement. So the denomination that I am a part of, the Presbyterian Church in America, the PCA, I believe that it's a church growth denomination with Reformed characteristics. What I mean by that is that really the heart of the sort of the bureaucratic and educational apparatuses of our denomination are so heavily influenced by the church growth movement that they really can't understand themselves apart from it. And I think that it's for that reason that the PCA is in trouble. But I don't mean to pick on the PCA. I think the Southern Baptist Convention is in the same boat. I think the Nazarenes are in the same boat. I think that I think the thing that's sort of unusual about the PCA is that the PCA was established right at the beginning of the church growth movement, or sort of right in sort of the heyday of it. And consequently, the question that I think a lot of us have in the PCA is, will we weather the storm? Will there be a denomination that's still known as the PCA in 30 years? Is an open question. There are a lot of people who are wondering. But I'm not trying to pick on the PCA. I think evangelicals, broadly speaking, are in the same boat. And we see evidence of that kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
Anyway, we should probably wrap it up at this point. Do you guys have any kind of final thoughts?
I think in terms with, overall, I think there is a place for sociological analysis within the level of secondary causality. But it needs to be analyzed, like all things need to be analyzed in light of the full, vision of the Christian faith. And also, there is the other thing is that, I think what has to govern all that. I don't agree, for example, with people like John Milbank on a lot of things, but one of the things I do agree with him on is that that the Christian vision of reality has to govern our use of these things. Theology is the queen, and theology needs to be governing our analysis of, interpretation of, and employment of these things. In some of the cases, it has been done well. In other cases, I think we've lost sight of it to the point that we almost, whatever. I'll give you a quick example. I think one of the easy temptations for so many denominations to easily move into an uncritical acceptance or limited critical acceptance of critical theory and critical race theory is because it's already uncritically brought in so much of the social sciences into its stuff that this is just another value neutral tool of analysis rather than something that's bringing, a Trojan horse that's bringing in it with a theology, a philosophy, a metaphysic, an ontology, a view of humanity, and everything else.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, Tom. Anything else you want to say, Glenn?
No, I think I'm done.
Okay. Well, anyway, we've pronounced the death of the church growth movement. Whether or not our fellow Christians will realize that it's dead is an open question. And I do think that there are people for whom this is the only way of sort of approaching the work of evangelism that they can even imagine. And those folks will either need to be completely disillusioned by the fact that the world has changed, or they're going to die themselves and just pass away, and something else is going to emerge. I do think that something else has got to have a long sort of time horizon, and that dominion, in terms of our theology of dominion and the relationship of the church to the doctrine and the practice of dominion, has to come into play. But anyway, those are my thoughts as I wrap up. Well, thanks a lot for listening to the Theology Pugcast. We appreciate your interest and support. And thank you to all those who give to us on a regular basis, who share the show with other folks. I don't know if there's anything else to say, but bye-bye.
Bye-bye.